Good morning again, friends. Steve here with another little update on a chat we had last night at the coffee shop. It was a great discussion. I think we had about 19 people there, and our topic for the evening was words in general, to do with conversation, and as a side, linguistic determinism. There was somebody who had come to our coffee chat once who suggested this topic. But we didn't cover it much because he wasn't there to give his side of it, and to be honest with you, none of us knew much about it, so we just proceeded with best we could, and mainly talking about the power of words that we give them and how it can help us with our, how we use our words, how it can help us or actually harm us, I guess you'd say, in our understanding and our use of words. We started out with a round of introductions with the idea of people giving input into the topic, which I think is working quite well because it gets us going, and it's more than just an introduction, it's a little bit more. I see that somebody mentioned something about neuro-linguistic programming, and in reference, something to do with can't versus won't. When somebody says they can't do something, is that they can't or they won't. So one can be more empowering than the other. It's because one is recognizing the self-determined approach, where can't is I'm unable to, won't is doesn't specify that I'm not able to, I'm just not going to do it. Don't need to, and this sort of thing. Somebody else mentioned how words have changed over the last 50 years or so, where, for example, the word want used to mean a lack, and now when people say I want something, the original meaning of that was I lack something. So, and also try, I'm going to try to do this, versus I will, or something like this. Somebody else mentioned how the whole modern communication devices and systems like Twitter have caused very serious abbreviation of words, and therefore has increased the potential to be misunderstood. There was the mention once again of the book Four Agreements, which I hope to read at some point, by Don Miguel Ruiz. I'm not sure, I don't have the book in front of me, but there was the point there about taking assumptions. That's one of the agreements, is to not take assumptions, make assumptions rather, to not take it personal, to be impeccable in our words, and I forget what the fourth one was. There was talk about interpretations, how we interpret something. There was the mention of how face-to-face is a much more complete way of getting meaning from words. And actually, I just remembered something here, that in courts and such, they have this thing called viva voce, which is Latin or Italian, I guess, for the live voice. And apparently that's seen as more powerful than the written word, because in the spoken word, it's more real. It's coming right from us, and it's more complete. Somebody mentioned the comment that we often make, that some people often make anyways, that how are you doing? Oh, not too bad. Well, how does that set us up? It means we're doing bad, but maybe we're not too bad. And also somebody mentioned how we can escape in our own delusion sometimes by saying, I did my best. When is that really the truth? What is our best? Sometimes we can't even define that really. Somebody else mentioned how there's different words used in different settings. So a meaning here is not a meaning here. For example, in legal and court documents, a word might have a completely different meaning, and we don't know that, which I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes actually. There was the mention of the power of suggestion in a word, the discernment of words, taking the moment to figure things out, getting clarification. We also diverged into animal communication for a while, about how examining the way animals communicate and what that means to us, and also the communication of eyes and how if we keep eye contact. Somebody mentioned particularly the right eye. Apparently it does. I didn't get the importance of that, so if somebody wants to chime in on that, that'd be great. So I had a few words too that I'll share here, but I won't share them in any great detail. Excuse me. If you want more detail on what I'm saying here, you can go to the written version of this, which is on the website as well, and I've written it out in more detail. Yeah, so I started out by I, like somebody else there, also read off a Wikipedia meaning of linguistic determinism, but I didn't go into it too much because I didn't feel qualified to make much of a comment on it, not having made the suggestion or having studied much into this. But basically, from what I understand it, is linguistic determinism says that language determines our thought. And I believe, some people say that there's a debate about it, but in the community that studies this sort of thing, there's people who agree with it, people who don't. But my understanding is that when cultures are examined, if their language of a culture does not have a concept or words or ways of describing certain ideas, then they don't develop in that area. And this might explain why certain cultures develop very well in certain areas, whereas they don't in others, and the same for others cultures. So the idea is that the ability to communicate through our linguistics determines our ability to grow in terms of our thought processes and so on. So it's kind of like the ceiling of our ability to communicate, obviously, or to think, you might say, is our linguistics determines that. So it's very much along the lines of, somewhat along the lines of what we talked about at our meeting, but we more talked about being able to understand words and the consequences of misunderstanding them in terms of what others are saying. So it's somewhat different. The presentation, a little few thoughts that I had, for example, is the use of words in determining our outcomes. So I'm going to just ramble on a little bit about this and I'll use one example about how one word can have a very huge impact on one's life. At our last speakers forum a week ago, there was the topic or the concept of bypass that came up. And what bypass is if we're going along in a conversation, a group of people or two people or what have you, and there's a misunderstanding in some way, one of us or both of us can as though take a detour or an off-ramp. So now we're no longer on the same page. We're in different areas and perhaps end up arguing or fighting simply because there was a misunderstanding of words and the way words are said and this sort of thing. Because realistically, we're the ones who give meaning to our words. And if we're not able to make ourselves understood or understand, then we're at odds. And in that presentation too, there was the concepts of connotation and denotation, which were brought up in ways of understanding words. And of course, the connotation is we're bringing in the mix of our emotions and what we feel the word means and the context, and that all mixed together. And the problem with that can bring sometimes is that, especially emotions, if they don't need to be there, they can cloud our judgment if we throw emotions in, because they can prevent us or cloud what's coming next in the conversation. Therefore, we don't get the full context of what's being said. And denotation is more of a literal definition of the word. And of course there's semantics that can come in too. I guess a good way to overcome some of these things is to ask questions or summarize. This is what I heard. This is what I understand of what you said. Is this correct? This sort of thing would prevent those bypasses because it shows respect. It shows that we're listening, and it shows that we're making an attempt to understand, because let's face it, we're already speaking different languages to a certain extent because we never completely understand each other. But in terms of denotation, there was one example given in that book of how a single word like the word set, S-E-T, actually has 194 meanings to it. So if we're taking things literally, then we don't know what's being said. And I have one example, which is an extreme example of how one word has deluded me for many years, and I suspect is deluding many others, because sometimes when I talk to people about it, they don't actually believe me, even though I can show them in writing that what I'm saying is valid. And this word is the word person versus, in contrast to the word man. And I'll go through a few minutes here of explaining how this has made a difference in my life. If you read older books, I would say 1920s and pre sort of thing, you'll see that the word man is used more often. When a man does this and so on, it's said. Today, in modern books, you'll often see that replaced by when a person does. I suspect it's because we're in an age where we want to be more inclusive, which is understandable because women have gone through this whole emancipation process and would feel left out if a book was just only talking about man. But you see, the thing is, man, the word man is both a man, is a member of the human race of the male sex. But man is also used, correctly used, to denote the mankind, reference to mankind. So a man can be man or woman. It would be grammatically correct. I remember reading an old book by Wallace Wattles, which was written in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he made the comment in there, which is a strange comment in today's context, where he said, he was talking about a particular concept that we had to learn. And he said, this is particularly challenging for a man to understand, especially if that man is a woman. We laugh today, but in those days that was understood what that was, because you understood it by the context. Anyways, I diverged for a little bit. What happened was, in my experience, is when I moved here to Saskatchewan and bought a piece of property, to say the least, to put it very mildly, I was not treated well by the local municipality. It seemed as though they weren't very welcoming, let's put it this way. So they put a lot of demands on me for this and that and the other thing, and it actually ended up they extorting about $54,000 out of me through basic threats and intimidation over damage to my property, essentially. And I didn't know anything about my rights, essentially. And because of this, which I'm grateful for now, by the way, I set upon learning a little bit about what was going on. Where was it that they got their authority? And this sort of thing started to come up in my consciousness, and I began to research things like the Constitution of Canada. And in particular, I was researching there this act that they kept on referring to in terms of the basis of their authority. And it was called the Uniform Building and Accessibility Standards Act of Saskatchewan. So I thought, at a certain point, well, like, I might as well read this thing. Like, where does it... If I've got to obey it, then surely it must say in there that I've got to obey it. So the interesting thing was that when I read the Act, right near the very beginning of the Act, it said that the Crown is bound by this Act. That's all it said. It was Article 3, actually. You can look it up. Just type it in. Saskatchewan Uniform Building and Accessibility Standards Act. I'm not trying to put anything over anybody here. This is my research. You can do your research if you want. The Crown is bound by this Act. So, and having studied law by then for a while, I realized that when things are said in legalese, unless it's said otherwise, when a statement is made like that, the Crown is bound by this Act, that means that nothing else is bound by it. If it said the Crown and, then those things are also bound. And bound, I looked it up, essentially means constrained, having to follow, having to abide by, and so on. That's what this term essentially means. So I got the impression then that the only way that I could be bound by this Act is that somehow they're presuming that I'm the Crown, which is really an odd thing. But it gets even stranger, and actually that may be true. They actually probably is true that they were presuming, not necessarily the people in the office at the RM, but their higher up legal counsel, shall we say, was running under that presumption. They must have been, that I was the Crown. Now that you might want to ask any questions about that later, but it's interesting. And anyways, it went down a road which was an interesting learning curve of many, many letters going back and forth. Almost no answers. That system runs on, it's a fraud system. That's what I found out. It's a system of lies and deception and sleight of hand to get us to agree to stuff that we don't have to do. But that, once again, is an aside. And part of it is that word person. One of the things I did is, because they kept referring to this one thing, because they were telling me that I was refusing them access to my building, and which I hadn't actually. I had invited them to come. To the contrary, but they went after me for a false claim, essentially. And they were referring to this one section, which is called the Power of a Building Official, 16.2 of this Act. And it started out by saying, if a person refuses. So I basically stopped there, because at this point, I was leaving nothing to my interpretation. At this point, I was learning a bit about communication, realizing, okay, what do they mean by these words? Because if it's true that every word has many meanings, maybe a person is something else. Because after all, the Crown is bound by this only. So maybe the person is a Crown. I don't know. I got to find this out. So I started a research into it. And every Act has an interpretation section, which is kind of like a definition section for words particular to that Act. And then words that are general, that are used in many different Acts, like the word person shows up in pretty much every Act and statute. There is, in most jurisdictions, an overriding or a larger Act, which is called an Interpretations Act. And in there's many common words. So I found this Act, the Interpretations Act, 1995. And in the general definition section, well, it's actually 27.1, is where it defines person. And this gets really interesting. It says, in an enactment, which is the process of creating an act, right? Person, includes a corporation and the heirs, executors, administrators, or other legal representatives of a person. So what I did is I basically threw out everything after the and, because it meant it had to have both. But if it said corporation, already I knew that I'm not a corporation, right? But so if it just said that if what it had said was a person is a corporation, then I would have known right away, okay, it's obviously not me that they're talking about. That crown must be a corporation. That must be what they're referring to. But because it said includes, that bewildered me. Because I thought that maybe what they were doing was telling me that, well, obviously it includes you, human beings, man, but just for clarity, it also includes a corporation, in case you didn't know. However, at this point, I had come to see that legalese and law is actually intended to be, great effort is made to make things very specific, almost mathematical. And from what I've learned in terms of drawing conclusions of what's being said, from that standpoint alone, there's no way from what this has been said that a person is a man. And in my research, I found something called maxims of law. And what maxims of law are, or a maxim in general, is a pithy statement of, which is kind of a weighty statement, a very important statement of generally agreed upon principles, almost universally agreed upon principles. So a maxim is like a, water is wet. I mean, nobody's going to deny that. But when it's liquid anyway, it's almost that strong. And these are used in law to help shape the color of what's being said. And there's a maxim in law, and these come down through Latin. I mean, they've been around forever. I mean, the way it's said is, in Latin, is inclusio unius est exclusio alterius. Anybody who knows Latin, you got it. Which means, in English approximately, the inclusion of one is the exclusion of another. So, in practical sense, if you were to say to me that the box on the table, which is closed, the contents of that box includes an apple and an orange, based on what you said, there would be no room for me to interpret that it contains anything else. However, if you were to say to me that the closed box on the table includes, but is not limited to, an apple and an orange, I could conclude that it has an apple and an orange, based on what you said, and something else. But I would still have no idea, I would have no basis for a conclusion of what it contained. See what I mean? So, essentially, the word includes is an exclusionary term to a certain extent. Having said that, from that, on the basis of the maxim, which is, once again, stands strong like water is wet, the word person includes a corporation and other things. In other words, it's got to have both. It's not or a corporation. It's a corporation and. So when they kept referring to me as having to follow these rules and regulations, and eventually it resulted in me being sent a notice to attend a court in reference to this. And the whole court case or court hearing was predicated upon this particular clause in this Act 16.2. And once again, it started off with if a person refuses. So what I did is I attended the court having given notice of special appearance, and what that means is there with a special appearance, I get to tell them why I'm there. They cannot presume why I'm there. It's based on what I tell them I'm there. And I attended the court as a man with all of my human rights intact. And I asked the judge what corporation I was presumed to be. And I pointed this out, and I read the Interpretations Act, and there was no denial whatsoever that this was legitimate, the definition. At least there was no answers. So in silence, there was no disagreement either. Then I finally asked, I said, I've come here as a man today, something like this. So I asked him specifically, I said, how come in your act there's no mention of if a man refuses, or a woman refuses, or a human being does? His head went down, his face went red, he wouldn't look at me. I had to ask him a second time, very firmly and in no uncertain terms, how come man, woman, human being is not there? He looked up at me, he paused, and he told me, I cannot answer that question. Which was very telling to me, because there was obviously a huge distinction, as I would infer from that, between the words person and human being. Now, you might ask, well, what's the importance of this? The importance of this is that I learned a lot. I learned the distinction between person and man. Now, they can be synonymous at times. A lot of times in just common conversation, common vernacular, we mean the same. But in certain situations, we can actually be enslaved by a word. For example, property taxes, fines, regulations, all these sort of things are based on a person. And according to this, a person is a corporation. So the question we got to ask ourselves is, have we been doing things based on a word that we didn't know? It's not always synonymous. To sum it up then, not knowing what each other means when we're talking in conversation can create a bypass, a complete separation. I think you mean one thing, you think you mean another. There's a chasm there. It can have its ramifications huge, as I just explained. I mean, this cost me hours of time and effort and all this sort of thing. And on a very everyday situation, it can cause misunderstandings in our relationships and us doing what we don't want to do. So that can be huge, right? However, when we get greater clarity on what the meaning of words, we can be on the same page in our relationships, or at least on the same road, at least understanding, or at least agreeing to disagree. Because then we have clarity in where we are, right? And to me, this is a much more empowering place to be. When we're in a more empowering place, we can definitely affect more determinedly our quality of life. Hope this has been helpful. If you want more details on this, have a read of the write-up section. Right? Talk to you again in a couple of weeks.